Hello everybody and welcome back. In this video we're going to be exploring the work of a very famous developmental psychologist named Lev Vygotsky. In particular, we're going to be looking at how a lot of his theories and concepts contrasted the work of Jean Piaget, the famous person we talked about in our previous lecture. To best understand the contrast between Vygotsky and Piaget, it feels importance to first review what it was that Piaget had proposed a little while before Vygotsky took the stage and started to argue that there were some flaws, some inherent issues with the work of Piaget. So first, just as a reminder, Jean Piaget is considered by many to be the first developmental psychologist ever. His focus was on what we call cognitive development. He surmised through his work with a multitude of different children that children not only didn't necessarily have the same information in their heads as adults, but they saw the world in a completely different way. And essentially, to transition from infancy into adulthood, what we needed to undergo were these stages of what he called cognitive development. He concluded that these stages were 4 parts, and that these 4 parts were essentially inherent. We were going to go through all of them at roughly the exact same time as everybody else, face similar challenges, and at about the age of 15, all come to an endpoint that left us with pretty much the same cognitive skills as our peers. His insistence was that this was done on its own, and that it allowed us to kind of better understand the different perspectives that kids had in their lives at different times. At the very end of that video, I mentioned that there was a lot of pushback when looking at the work of Piaget. Not because people disagreed with his notion that kids need to develop cognitively, but there were a lot of theorists and other people that looked at his work that suggested that maybe there were some issues with his attempts to really formulate a new approach to studying how the mind unfolded. To be fair to Piaget, he didn't have any predecessors to critique. He didn't have a lot of footnotes to go off of. He was essentially inventing things as he went along. So it's sort of understandable that he maybe missed the mark on a couple things, but if we're looking for some really important concepts that were disputed after Piaget came out, well, some of those things were alluded to in our last video. One of the big issues that people had with Piaget's work was that the accuracy of his ages seemed to be a little off in his original estimates. In terms of the ability to understand objects, like we saw in the video in our last class, it seems that many kids should actually be able to understand object permanence a little bit earlier than Piaget had thought. The same thing goes for conservation. It was mentioned in the last video that it's actually a part of the end of the pre-operational stage that kids start to answer conservation questions correctly, but it's not until they get into what's called the concrete operational stage that they start to understand why the answers about conservation are correct. Newer research has suggested that maybe kids are actually a little bit more adept at understanding the concept of conservation than Piaget had originally thought. Of course, it doesn't mean that he was always underselling the performance of kids. Many other researchers have contended that when we look at the abstract reasoning that he said almost all children understand by the time they reach 15, we might have really missed when most kids, or most adults for that matter, get to the end of this particular stage. In fact, some theorists have argued that many adults never quite get through that formal operational stage and never quite have the cognitive flexibility that many of their peers have. And this brings us to another really critical element to the kind of dispute over Piaget's findings and Piaget's general assumptions about cognitive development. Many have argued since Piaget's work that his absolute timelines and his insistence that interaction was not critical was flawed. Essentially, researchers have argued that different cultures go through certain things at different rates, and that there's a ton of variability from person to person that leads us at different places at different ages, and some that are getting to the finish line much faster than others, and some that maybe aren't ever getting to the finish line on this concept of cognitive development. Champion of this counter-argument of Piaget. He's the person who really sought to contend that when we look at cognitive development, it's not this absolute thing. It's the researcher I mentioned earlier and the one that we'll focus on through the majority of this lecture. The researcher named Lev Vygotsky. He was actually a Russian theorist looking at the work of Piaget, trying to make a name for himself at roughly the exact same time, that became extremely interested in this same concept of cognitive development. But he contended, when looking at his patients, or I guess participants, not really patients, that kids showed a great degree of variability from child to child. And that if the right environment was created, there's no need to have this unfolding process happen in some scripted manner. Instead, it could be accelerated or, in some cases, slowed down due to the interactions that these children were having with their peers or some type of an adult figure. And this ability to slow up or speed down this growth in cognitive skills became the focus of Vygotsky's work, and it led to a bunch of different tangential ideas that really blossomed into a full-fledged concept of how we could harness our understanding of cognitive development for better purposes. If we want to boil Vygotsky's theory down to just two terms, the two terms that are often linked to him are these concepts of something called zones of proximal development and scaffolding, because both of these speak to his insistence that cognitive growth is not this abrupt stage-by-stage process, and instead it's a very multifaceted, continual thing that kids are undergoing. Essentially, he said, we can't lump a bunch of things together and say, yeah, from 2 to 6, this is what's happening. He said, well, for some kids, they might be learning one element of that area at a year and a half. Others might be learning different elements of that area at around 7 or 8. It's all based on some type of readiness and some type of environment that really brings out the cognitive skills within the child. And this is where the concepts of zones and proximal development and scaffolding play a role in this process. Vygotsky argued that essentially what Piaget was doing in his work was leaving kids on their own and allowing them to come to conclusions and kind of go through the mental breakthroughs required for advancement at their own pace. He said for most kids, if you weren't catching it, this would eventually lead us to the conclusion that essentially kids had large periods where they couldn't do something, and then boom, they'd hit this phase and they might magically be able to do that thing, or it might look like they're magically able to do that thing the next day. But he said there's this sweet spot, this zone where kids have started to transition to being able to learn certain ideas, certain concepts, if we want to borrow from Piaget's terminology, certain schemas, but they can't necessarily learn these things on their own. They need some type of assistance from somebody that understands the concept or can at least explain the concept just a little bit better than where they're at. And this is where the concept of scaffolding comes into play. It's trying to teach a topic at a level that's just slightly above the level of understanding of the person being taught. A classic example of this is, say, 5th graders teaching 2nd graders, or actually 4th graders would even be better, or graduate students offering information on a topic for undergraduate students, where there's a difference in understanding and comprehension, but the difference isn't so much that both sides can't understand each other. This idea of scaffolding, then, what makes it so important? It's tough to understand this unless we really go back to the contrast between Vygotsky and Piaget. Remember, Piaget essentially said we're all on the same path. We're all going to reach the finish lines at pretty much the same time, and there's not much you can do about it. Vygotsky's insistence that scaffolding could work, that kids could advance through certain things a little bit faster if they received this type of treatment, explains some of the differences we see between cultures and between individuals. Essentially, if a child is scaffolded correctly, throughout the vast majority of their childhood and early cognitive development, well, that child will speed through things at a pace that's unmatched by their peers. We'll create a world where a child can understand things at a very complex level at a very young age. And will also consequently create some children who are, because they weren't scaffolded, because we had to wait until the very end, still struggling with basic concepts that a lot of their peers have been able to master. This focus on helping kids accelerate through things cannot be discounted. And it can really help us understand some of the things that Piaget's theory couldn't. It leads to another really important concept that Vygotsky grasped onto, was his notion that language was essential to cognitive development. In Piaget's ideas, language was kind of a step along the way. He talked about symbolism and how that was a critical player in a lot of our cognitive development, but his focus on language pretty much ended there. For Vygotsky, language was considered sort of an element to development. It was a critical player in our ability to transition from our most basic understanding of the world to much more complex ideas. And to explain how this worked, he started to detail two different types of speech. The first speech he talked about was something called public speech, essentially something we're capable of doing at around a year to 2 years of age, where we can start to communicate ideas and learn from others through spoken language. Now, this public speech can be extremely helpful. There's certainly no shortcomings to it. But in terms of getting somebody advanced through things, it might be limiting. Instead of using public speech, he said many kids, and around 3, 4, or 5 years of age, start to develop this other thing called inner speech, where they can start to grasp ideas and wrestle with concepts within their own heads instead of outwardly. And he argued that, much like lots of other concepts, inner speech would be something that could actually be scaffolded into a child. You could teach a child to have an inner dialogue, to utilize that inner dialogue in very special ways. And in doing this, you could potentially really help speed up a child's ability to master some of the more complex ideas. Now, he also insisted that this was something that could really help children develop good social skills. They could kind of have that filter watching out for saying things that would offend others or harm people. There's not a lot of research necessarily that's been a strong supporter or at least advocate of this idea. There's not a ton of people that have shown that kids who develop this inner monologue when they're very young have really adept social skills when they're, say, teenagers or adults. But if we're looking for a real value to this, we have shown numerous studies that this inner speech can help with other problem solving, more complex thinking that we wouldn't necessarily tie to the ability to talk in our head. The belief is that this is probably a byproduct of inner speech helping us with other mental things. It might help us with planning, organization, memory enhancement. Essentially, it can tap into a lot of other really important cognitive tasks, much like the ones we're going to be discussing in our next class, that we take for granted that can help us in our kind of overarching attempts to grow cognitively from childhood into adulthood. We're looking for, again, other contributions from Piaget that were imperfect. This focus on language that Vygotsky picked up is another great example of how adding to Piaget really gives us a clearer picture of childhood development. We can understand the importance of these ideas that Vygotsky pushed, I thought we could do kind of a hypothetical scenario or explore a hypothetical scenario. What I'd like for you to do in this one is imagine you were a teacher and you were trying to help school children, maybe kids in second, third grade, start to master basic math. Most second, third graders are just getting at things like multiplication, division, but it's a struggle for a lot of them. It's a very challenging thing. If I were a teacher, how would I get a child to try to tackle this idea simply based off of Piaget's concepts? I'm guessing most of you, when I propose this, are already thinking, I don't have much to work with. Right? Piaget assumed that kids just can or can't do it, and to overcome it, they just have to kind of encounter enough problems that they're willing and able to create schemas that help them understand this new idea. But if I'm embracing Vygotsky's concept of cognitive development, suddenly I've got a lot more to work with. Suddenly we can talk about scaffolding a child to learn something at a much faster pace. We could discuss how maybe when the child is learning something, we can use language or have a child that's just slightly older than them teach them this concept. And in doing so, really accelerate the kid through that and then move them on to the next stage or more complex versions of this multiplication and division. And this is something that we see in a lot of our very good schools. Numerous high-end schools incorporate Vygotsky's concepts of peer-to-peer teaching, focuses on language, and focuses on kind of problem solving that involves back and forth communication. Because there's this recognition that by doing this, children can really not only advance through these things faster, but tackle much more complex ideas than their peers, and in the end, at a different place than a lot of their peers. It might not be as complex and there might not be as many elements to Vygotsky's ideas as there were in Piaget's, but the utility of Vygotsky's ideas is undeniable. It also led us to is this recognition that once we reach 15, there's no finish line that we're crossing. There's still a long way to go for many of us, and there's lots of individual differences in cognitive skills. The work of Vygotsky and some what we call neo-Piagetians, people that followed along the lines of Piaget. We mentioned one in our last class. But this group of individuals, along with people looking at the work of Vygotsky, later went on to contend that we don't actually reach any finish line at 15. Instead, what we start to see is kind of individual differences in cognitive skills emerging based on what we push ourselves in, what we're focusing on as we advance throughout adulthood. What many neo-Piagetians have argued is that one skill that we start to develop is this thing called pragmatic thinking, where we can essentially solve problems better based on the solutions we've found to past problems that are similar. If you're very pragmatic, you can navigate through a lot of new things by figuring out how things fit. If we're looking at the pictures on the left, essentially we can learn when to put the square pegs in the square holes and the circular pegs in the circular holes because of what we've done in the past. If we're not so good at it or we've never encountered these things, we might unfortunately just keep jamming those square pegs in those round holes. Another thing that develops a little bit later is something called dualistic or reflective thinking, where we start to recognize the world as, actually, it's called reflective thinking. Sorry, I'm reading instead of thinking. In reflective thinking, we're finally transitioning from seeing the world in a dualistic way, where we see the world as right or wrong, and instead start recognizing that there are gray zones. The classic example of dualistic thinking in adults in our current era is when people tend to kind of be on one side of the political spectrum or the other and can't possibly understand that there's other opinions that need to be heard. Some think of one group as the devil and they're the angels, or vice versa, and anything that their group is doing has to be right. People that can recognize that there's in-betweens, there's conversations that can be had, and even if you don't necessarily agree with somebody, there's different perspectives to take, really highlights this concept of reflective thinking. And it also brings up another type of thinking that's just recently been introduced, something called relativist thinking, where you can actually recognize that others walking into a situation don't come in with the same information and don't come in with the same beliefs slash, I guess, anticipations of what's going to happen. This relativist thinking can really help somebody understand how a situation is going to play out and how to communicate with others based on the differing opinions or differing expectations that everybody has. And it's led to this belief that as we grow through adulthood, maybe we're all continuing to develop in a new way. In fact, Neo-Piagetians introduced a term to explain this growth. They called it post-formal thought. This notion that there are individual differences in adults that result from really the growth in other types of thinking that not everybody grows in. And where we are in that growth can really explain a lot of the differences in people's kind of cognitive flexibility and ability to really master and understand the world around us. But please understand that when we're talking about this growth in thinking, I'm not trying to suggest that one political belief is correct while the other one has to be wrong, or that one person who's smarter than another person has to inherently be doing something right. Intelligence is based off of your ability to do well on intelligence tests, and there's lots of gray zones as to what those things imply. But if we're just looking at people's ability to kind of change their cognitive thinking, this is something that we think is really a continual process. And the result of this is very multifaceted. At the results of the growth that we see in cognitive behaviors of adults can really highlight where we're going from here. In particular, what we're going to be doing is breaking down other aspects of cognitive change that are a little bit more specific and slightly more complex at the same time. They can understand how this unfolding process happens a little bit more directly. In particular, in our next class, we're going to be talking about the growth in our processing, memory, attention, thinking, and metacognition skills. And then afterwards, we're going to transition back to this idea of individual differences when we start spending some time talking about intelligence. But for now, we're going to wrap up this module here. I encourage you to, if you haven't, watch all those extra videos that I linked up. Well, I guess the one extra video for this module. I encourage you to make sure that you understand these concepts really well by going through the readings, because there's a lot more added there. And if you've done that, get those writings done and you're ready for the next module. Until the next time, take care.